Good day, everyone. My name is Mel Ochoa, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Landmark Ventures. Welcome, everybody, today. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to all of our essential heroes out there working hard every day on the front lines. We really appreciate it. And then secondly, we hope everyone in attendance is staying safe and healthy, and we wish you the best during these uncertain times. I am, like I said, the Chief Operating Officer at Landmark Ventures. We produce the Social Innovation Summit each year, which is happening next week. And you can register online at www.socinnovation.com. Today, we have an amazing event with two inspirational leaders from AARP and the Robin Hood Foundation. We've sent all attendees a digital brochure with the agenda and bios, and we are taking questions from the audience that will be asked in the conversation. So please submit those through Zoom. As part of the Social Innovation Summit, we also partner with organizations to amplify conversations, partnerships, and solutions around our biggest issues facing the world today. AARP is teaming up with the Social Innovation Summit on a 7-part series to talk with national leaders about issues that impact longer and healthier lives. We have all seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has further exposed inequalities that have long existed. Although disheartening and frustrating, it gives us all attending today the opportunity to seize this moment to rebuild our communities to serve everyone equally. Today, Jean from AARP and Wes from the Robin Hood Foundation are going to discuss opportunities to rebuild our communities from this crisis. I'd like to welcome in Jean to this conversation, Senior Vice President, Global Thought Leadership. And while he's coming into the conversation, I just want to say that we have had amazing response with Wes Moore joining us. I personally read all of the emails that come in, and everyone has some sort of tie or connection into Wes Moore. And even those who could not attend today sent emails saying, I'm so sad that I can't attend. So I think this is, I think people are really excited about joining us today, and we thank everyone. Hi, Jean, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Mel. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for your leadership around this issue and also in this event series. So would love to turn it over to you and hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mel. As Mel indicated, I am Jean Accius. I'm the Senior Vice President of Global Thought Leadership at AARP. I am extremely excited about the conversation that we're going to have today. As Mel also indicated, COVID-19 has really laid to bear some of the inequities that we've seen that has long existed. And we are at an inflection point. We have a decision to make and an opportunity before us. And how we, as a society, as a community, and as industry leaders decide to respond will put us on a certain path. One path could potentially reinforce the inequities that we see, or we could be bold, we could be courageous, and actually start to rebuild and reimagine a future that really harnesses our interconnectivity and really reaffirms that we are all in this together to ensure that all people have an opportunity to experience a healthier and longer life. This is our moment. This is our time. And this is why I'm extremely excited and also humbled to have Wes Moore be with us today to actually kick off this series of conversations. Wes is the CEO of Robin Hood Foundation, which is one of the largest anti-poverty forces in the nation. He is an author of 2 New York Times best-selling books. He is a combat veteran and a social entrepreneur. Wes, please welcome Wes to the stage. How are you today, Wes?
I am doing so well, Gene. This is beyond an honor. I'm so humbled to be able to join you on this virtual stage. Humbled to see everybody, and thank y'all for logging in. But I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. So thank you for the invitation. It means a lot.
Well, thank you so much for saying yes. I want to jump right on in, Wes, and really kind of start off with one of your books. I've had an opportunity to read both of your books, and I know that you also have one that's going to be coming out next month. Can you for those who don't know your story, can you kind of share with us how you came to realize that there was another Wes Moore, and what did that actually do to you personally, and what does that suggest to us as we kind of think about this environment in which we're in?
Well, and first, and thank you for that question, because when I think about my journey, I come from, I am the descendants of activists and teachers, and ministers and truth tellers and storytellers. My grandfather actually was the first one in my family was actually born in the United States. He was born down in Charleston, South Carolina. And actually it was the Ku Klux Klan that ran him and my great-grandparents out of this country initially. My great-grandfather was a minister, and was, I guess, was a little too vocal. And eventually, after threats on him and his family continued to become more intense, he decided to move the family back to Jamaica, where their home is from, where they're from. And the majority of my family made a pledge to never come back to the United States. But my grandfather made a different pledge. He always pledged to come back. He felt that this was the country of his birth, that this was the country that he was a proud birth citizen of. And so he eventually came back to the United States, went on to go to school at Lincoln University, a proud HBCU over in Pennsylvania, and eventually became the first Black minister in the history of the Dutch Reformed Church. The church was actually the official church of apartheid South Africa. And I think very much about who I am, and I didn't realize until I got older, was very much born through the DNA that came through my family. My grandmother, who was actually born in Cuba and became a school teacher in the South Bronx for 29 years. My mother, who in her 20s, became unexpectedly and in many ways unprepared, became a widow with 3 children that she was going to raise on her own. And really took a skill set that she had built out where, she got her first job that actually gave her benefits, the first job that ever gave her, the ability to work one job. She got that job when I was 14 years old. This is a woman who pushed and sacrificed. And so I think so much of who I am come from them. I also know that, when I first discovered the other Wes Moore was after having a childhood that was, full of a lot of ups and downs, frankly. And the first time that I felt handcuffs on my wrist was when I was 11 years old. We moved from Maryland up to New York after my father died when I was young. And some of the biggest challenges and difficulties I had and adjustments I had was when I actually moved up to New York, moved up to the Bronx to go live with my grandparents. And I noticed that as I was going through this transition, eventually was sent to military school, eventually through a lot of second chances and a lot of opportunities and a lot of people, frankly, just seeing something in me before I was ready to even see it in myself, I now received this Rhodes Scholarship as I was finishing up college. And the same time that I was being announced as this Rhodes Scholar, and the papers were writing these articles about me and my life and my journey, and they were also writing a story about another guy named Wes Moore, who was involved in a botched armed jewelry store robbery, who was now about to spend the rest of his life in prison. And I was taken by this idea that, frankly, just learning about his story, learning about this journey, and learning about the tragic murder of Sergeant Bruce Prothero, because in this botched jewelry store armed robbery, an off-duty police officer was killed that day. And that's what led to the life sentence of Wes and his older brother and 2 other people. But one of the things I was really taken by, it wasn't just the tragedy of what happened to Sergeant Prothero, but it was also about the fact that how thin that line is between our life and somebody else's life. And how very quickly as a society, we can be unfortunately rapid in either congratulating certain stories or castigating others without knowing about the backgrounds, how they got there, and being able to really delve into the lessons learned upon this. And so that was really what I wanted to do with that story of when I first discovered the other Wes Moore. And we've now been close to over 17 years. He's now in year 20 of his life sentence in prison. He's still currently in prison in Jessup, Maryland. But in many ways, the process of discovering that Wes Moore was really an important process of discovering this one as well, and being able to understand the journey that I was on and the journey of the type of impact that I wanted to see and I wanted to make.
Well, thank you so much, Wes. There's a couple of points in the book where I personally had to put the book down and to kind of reflect even on my own personal journey. So I just want to thank you just for how candid you were about talking about your own journey, moving from Baltimore to the Bronx, and what did all that mean to you personally, and also kind of thinking about how where you live matters in many ways. There's a point in the book where you went to go visit Wes, and you point blank said to him, you wanted to ask him this question, and the question was, are we a product of our environment? And I was really, those was one of those aha moments for me. So, I wanted to pose that question to you, knowing what you know and the life that you've lived and continue to live of service. To what extent are we a product of our environment?
I love that question, Gene. I really do. And, and I tell you, Wes was the one who actually added so much clarity to me with that question. Because, I remember hearing that so many times as I was growing up. People are products of their environments. People are products of their environments. And I heard it so many times that I kind of just swallowed it eventually and just said, it's 1 + 1 = 2, right? People are products of their environments. And I remember once going to talk to Wes, and we were talking about Baltimore. And we were talking about our old neighborhood. I mean, literally to the point that, at the time of arrest, we were literally living blocks away from each other. And I asked him, I said, so do you think that we're products of our environments? And he looked at me and he literally changed at that time, 24 years of thinking. He changed it in a sentence when he looked back at me and he said, actually, I think we're products of our expectations. Mm-hmm. And as soon as he said that, I thought to myself, he is absolutely right. We weren't products of our environments. We were products of our expectations. And someone once said to me, they said, it's a real shame that you lived up to your expectations and Wes didn't. And I said, the real shame is that we both did. We both ended up exactly where we thought we would end up at some point, because the expectations that people have of themselves, they don't come from nowhere. The expectations that people have of themselves, they come from the expectations that other people have of them. And they internalize them and they make them their own. And so the thing and so why I think Wes was right to challenge me on this idea that people are products of their environments. It's not that environments don't matter, because environments do matter. In fact, I think it's actually a very delicate marriage between environments and expectations, and we can't pretend like environments don't matter. But the thing about environments they're shaped by expectations. They're shaped by what we expect from people. And we can't pretend like our children and our families and our communities don't know that. I know that I was raised in a community that was chronically neglected. And I knew it by the air that we were asked to breathe. I knew it from the water we were asked to drink. I knew it from the schools we were asked to attend. I knew it from the homes we were asked to live in. I knew it from the way that our community was policed. I knew it from every single dimension, because everything around us is screaming at you that something is different for you. And so how we think about our environments, we can't just pretend, we can't do a Pontius Pilate where we're just washing our hands of responsibility and say, well, look at how they grew up, or look at who their parents were, or look at that neighborhood. Because what we're doing as a society, if we don't realize it, we're washing our hands of responsibility because somehow it makes us sleep better at night. And what it's doing is it's embedding our own complicity in this. We cannot embed our own complicity. We have to challenge it. And that's where Wes was spot on right when he said that we are not products of our environments. We're products of our expectations, because in many ways our environments are completely influenced by the expectations that we have about who lives there.
Along those same lines, Wes, when we look at Baltimore and we look at zip code, and we think about life expectancy and the opportunity to be able to live a longer and healthier life. When you look at Baltimore, life expectancy in Sandtown is about 70 years. And only a few miles away in Rolling Park is about 84. What can we do to ensure that people of color, communities of color, and those with low incomes have the opportunity to live a longer and healthier life?
It's staggering, because when you're looking at the difference between the Sandtown and a Roland Park, you're literally talking less than 2 miles. And we can't act like that's unintentional. You know, the life expectancy for a child growing up in Harlem Park in Baltimore is the same as a child growing up in North Korea. Think about this. And when we look at that discrepancy, that a couple miles can make the difference between a decade or more on your life expectancy, and you look at all the things that are the reasons for that lowered life expectancy. You know, you look at the fact that 80% of the violence that's, perpetrated in a city like a Baltimore, and again, Baltimore is unfortunately we've had a streak of years where it's been consistently 300 plus homicides in a city that is now under 600,000 people. I mean, it's a staggering number. And you look at how a lion's share of those actually take place in a handful of neighborhoods. You look at the fact that, if you're a child growing up in Baltimore, that 25% of children are growing up with asthma. You look at the accelerated levels of everything from diabetes to into the reality of lead poisoning, and how many children are still dealing with the reality of lead-based piping, plumbing, paint, and even as the CDC said, just 5 microbes of every deciliter of lead inside of your blood means that person's going to have cognitive challenges for the remainder of their lives. So we know exactly how to and what things we should be addressing and treating. We know how we can put public dollars to work in very real ways. There's something called the marginal value of public funds, which is the MVPF, and looking at what is the highest return that you can have on public dollars. And part of the way I think we have to think about the utilization of public dollars and how that's actually allocated really goes back to an idea of being able to understand how public dollars have actually historically been used to separate, how public dollars have actually been used to create disparities, how when you look at the history of everything from redlining, discriminatory housing policies, discriminatory lending policies. So we have seen how public dollars through generations have been made to separate people. We now have to be very deliberate about using these MVPFs to actually bring people together. We know which aspects of this marginal value of public dollars, about where you're going to get the largest amounts of return. You can get large amounts of return if you make investments in things like health and education, through our children and early childhood. We also know that you get some of the highest levels of MVPFs if you're actually looking at focusing on adults that have a spillover into the children that they are around, whether it's their children, their grandchildren, or their guardians. Right? We know the way we can invest public dollars to create a higher value. And we know that part of our job is to invest public dollars in a way to be able to address some of the ways that public dollars have historically been used to create the discrepancies and the disparities that we all have to live with today.
Wes, I had an opportunity to hear you give an interview with Aspen Institute, and you mentioned the importance of policy and how policy matters. Can you say a little bit more for our audience in terms of what role does policy play in helping us improve some of these issues? And then just a follow-up to that question, the CEO, Jamie Dimon, last week released a letter where he said it was a call to action that private industry, public sector, nonprofit sectors, philanthropy, needed to really build a coalition to address some of the stark inequities that we're seeing. And I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of exactly, on one hand, what is the role of public policy? And on the other, how can public policy help complement the need for other sectors and industries to really chime in order to address some of these issues?
So I remember when I first came on as the CEO of Robinhood. And even some of the conversations that we had even during the whole process, right? Where, to be frank, my initial reaction was no. And it was for a few different reasons. One of which was I said, I've been actually pretty skeptical of philanthropy in the past. And the response by the person who's leading the search committee, who was the board chair, he said to me, we've done our homework and we've seen it because it's all over YouTube. I mean, it's not hidden. But the response that he gave back to me, he said, but actually, we actually believe a lot of what you're saying was right. That there is not one group or one vertical or one area that is responsible for the levels of economic inequality and economic injustice that we have in our society. So therefore, it is all of our responsibilities to have a role in addressing it. And so the ability for the private sector, for the public sector, for philanthropy, for the people to be able to use our voice and use our stretch is imperative. I think about the role of Robin Hood, where over the history and the duration of Robin Hood, now Robin Hood initially started over 32 years ago as an organization that was making about $40,000 worth of grants, and with an exclusive focus on addressing the issue of poverty, using data, using metrics, using all sectors of society to be able to address this. Now, over 30 years later, Robin Hood has allocated north of $3 billion into the poverty fight, focusing on every single area where poverty is either the cause or the consequence. So education, housing, mental health, criminal justice reform, immigration, collection of different issues that we focus on, that we fund, that we find, that we build, that addresses this. I also know that currently, the budget for the Department of Education in New York City alone hovers around $27 billion. That's for New York City alone. And so part of our job and part of our responsibility is to make sure that our capital is catalytic. Part of our job and part of our responsibility is to making sure that our private and our philanthropic dollars are going to the most effective organizations who are performing the most important social service work. But part of our responsibility as well is to make sure that we have policies that are not putting people and keeping people in poverty. Part of our responsibility is to make sure that these public dollars that we're talking about are actually being used to generate a level of sustainable economic income and a sustainable economic mobility for our families and for the communities that we serve, so we don't have to continue plugging holes as the holes continue to show themselves. And so when we're talking about the role that policy is going to play, I think what Jamie Dimon said, and what we watched a collection of other leaders in business and philanthropy and the social service sector do right now, and really stepping up in really powerful and profound ways of approaching our work with a level of urgency about the fact that we have to be able to raise and get capital out the door. And at the same time, we have to be able to approach it with a certain level of humility. In this idea that if we are not able to influence the public conversation, if we're not able to talk about things like how Robin Hood, for example, we think about the work that we've been doing around SNAP and ABT expansion during this process, and being able to make sure that we can allocate disaster SNAP in the most efficient ways to get people who are going hungry, making sure they're getting the resources that they need. If we're not coming up with really profound ways of thinking about partnerships, like the way that we have been able to create partnership, for example, with organizations like the Mayor's Fund in New York City and the Black Family and Aramark, to think about how are we using initiatives called the New York City Healthcare Heroes, to making sure that those who are on these front lines, and again, both not just doctors and nurses, but we're also talking about people who are the food delivery people, the orderlies, the janitors, people who are struggling with this idea of poverty and being the working poor prior to COVID-19, making sure that they continue to get the support that they need in order to protect and sustain for their families, but also making sure that poverty does not have to be some recurring, some recurring challenge in their family's folklore. So how do we think creatively about that? But that also must include the ability to pull the policy lever and to be able to influence policymakers as they're making decisions that are in the best interests of all of us and all of the people. Because truthfully, when we think about the history of this, that has not always been the case.
Wes, in your book, the other Wes, there's a segment where you talk about your father. And I'm going to read it to you so the audience can actually hear this. And then I want to ask you a question. In the book, you say, "My father was dead 5 hours after having been released from the hospital with the simple instruction to get some sleep. The same hospital was now preparing to send his body to the morgue. My father had entered the hospital seeking help, but his face was unshaven, his clothes disheveled, his name unfamiliar, his address not in an affluent area. The hospital looked at him askance, insulted him with ridiculous questions, and basically told him to fend for himself." I was really touched by that. And I know that it's been about 38 years. And I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of how can we ensure that all communities who've been deeply affected by COVID-19 or other medical conditions can really start to rebuild in a way that ensures that we are addressing misdiagnoses and that where someone lives should not matter in terms of the type of care that they receive.
Yeah. I still can't shake the feeling that I and my family was robbed. That we were robbed. I mean, I still very much feel his presence every day. I still very much feel like he watches over me. I still very much feel like he's playing his position from on high, mm-hmm. and he's moving things out of the way for me, and he's helping me and guiding me, and I take the fact that his blood runs through me very seriously. Yeah. And I still can't shake the feeling that I was robbed. And I was robbed for the fact that there were people who, when they saw him, they saw something less than. Mm-hmm. I think about it in context of the world that we live in now, where we watch these daily reminders of this, of it's a lack of appreciation of humanity in people. It's a lack of appreciation of a basic dignity. And that when you're looking at someone else, you are seeing a mirror reflection, and you should see a mirror reflection of God's grace staring back at you, no matter who that person is. And the fact that a person's cries for help, a person's cries for support, a person's cries that they can't breathe, that isn't enough to move people, and how heartbreaking that is. I think about this in reflection to my own father, where when he went to the hospital because he died from something called acute epiglottitis. And what acute epiglottitis is, it's a medical condition where, all of us have an epiglottis in our throat, and it lifts every time we breathe or we chew. And when it lifts in the air, it's lifting because it's allowing air to get into your windpipe. And basically what acute epiglottitis is, it's a swelling of the epiglottis to the point that it becomes so heavy that it just sits there and it's not able to lift. So in essence, what happened was his body choked itself. When he went to the hospital, he was looking for help because he didn't know what was going on. He wasn't asking for judgment. And I think that how we think about this in respect to right now, he wasn't asking for people to question whether or not he had insurance. He was looking for help. A human being asking another human being for help. I think about this even in respect to how this moment has changed, changed the way that I very much look at this world, and it's partially because we have to appreciate the fact that we had so many of these challenges and these dynamics that took place well before COVID-19. If you look at Robinhood research alone, prior to COVID-19, close to 50% of people could not afford a $400 shock with cash. Close to 50%. Well, that shock is here, and it's a lot more than $400. If you look at prior to COVID-19, half of all New Yorkers had spent at least a year in poverty over the past 4 years. If you look at a prior, if you look at what's happened since COVID-19, 22% of people that have lost their jobs now are people who were living in poverty prior. So think about what that means. 22% of people who have lost their jobs since COVID-19 were living in poverty prior to COVID-19, i.e. these were people who were living in poverty and working. The working poor. So when we're talking about things like, when we're talking about how do we rebuild our society better, because frankly, I am not interested in just rebuilding. We have to rebuild better. We have to rebuild with an idea that there are certain things that we just cannot as a society accept anymore. We can't accept an idea that we can have someone who is working a full day's work and still living in poverty. We can't accept the idea that we have tens of millions of people in this country prior to COVID-19 who don't have health insurance. And a singular incident is enough to knock them and their family and their entire trajectory off base. Where we have employment that is, where we have insurance that's exclusively tied to your employment. And so when we watch the fact that we have gone now from 3.8% unemployment, 3.9% unemployment to now 7 weeks later, and we're hovering over 20% unemployment in certain communities, that number is hovering closer to 30 and 40% unemployment. What exactly does that mean in terms of people's opportunities to thrive? When we look at the reality that if you look at just education, for example, when schools closed in New York City alone, 300,000 children lacked access to basic devices to complete their schoolwork. 45,000 students are still without one. In Baltimore City, around 20% of students haven't logged on once since we've gone to remote learning. So there are some fundamentals that we've got to get right. And so when we're thinking about it, how I think about how that reflects in my life, in my trajectory, in my father's physical absence, that singular occurrence was enough to knock our family off his axis. When my father one day sought help and didn't get it. How then do we make sure that we are creating frameworks and supports for our large society so that these singular incidences, no matter how horrific and tragic they are not enough to determine what is going to be the destiny for many people who frankly aren't even to the point that they can even have a say. That's the type of society that we have to rebuild.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that, Wes. Thank you for being candid, for really sharing your experience, your insights with us. I know that it wasn't easy to do, but I wanted you to know how impactful it has been to millions of people who've read your books and who's heard your stories. You are an inspiration. And I know for sure that your dad is looking down and saying, well done, my son. And to continue to do that. I want to, well, it is profoundly true. I think that in the day and age in which we live, that we do need to be inspired. And we need to really kind of think outside the box for these creative solutions to ensure that no family has to experience some of these devastating issues that we're seeing. And I think, again, to your point, now's the time to actually have these tough conversations, but really to roll up our sleeves and do the deep work. And it's going to require some work. And I totally agree with you 100%. That it's not about rebuilding, it's about rebuilding better. And really putting the families at the center of the systems and the frameworks that we need to create to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to really achieve their God-given potential.
Amen.
With that, I wanted to talk to you about cultivate. I had an opportunity, and you'll see all my little sticky tabs and notes on all the book. in the world. I was really inspired just for your journey. And it really kind of spoke to me in a very meaningful way. Can you talk about purpose and the importance of finding purpose throughout your lifespan? And then just as a follow-up to that, what role did mentors play in helping to navigate your journey?
You know, I think about my entire professional journey has really been this quest and this search and this pull and this push where as I was going through, you know, I think one of the most dangerous things about for much of my childhood actually was if people asked me, what do you want to do? Or where do you see yourself or whatever like that? I didn't have an answer. And when I was younger, I didn't realize how dangerous an answer that was, not having an answer. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, life has a really nasty and cynical sense of humor for those who don't take it seriously. For those who don't have a point and have some kind of direction as to where they want to end up. And I think that one thing that actually started to happen to me as I began to get older, as I, you know, began to actually have some accomplishments and feeling leadership and feeling that felt good, and then actually striving and searching to taste more of it. Eventually joining the Army, eventually going on to college and all this kind of stuff, was I came to this point then that I had a lot of people who were then feeding me their ideas and their thoughts about what they thought I should do. And it was all coming from a place of love. It was all coming from a place of their experience, their advice. Hey, Wes, you should do X because this is how you should be thinking about it. You should do Y because this is the best place for you to end up. You should do Z because these are all the smart people do, right? And I ended up taking a lot of that counsel and a lot of that advice because these were people who I was now entering and venturing into spaces that my family not only had never been before, hadn't even knew existed. Rooms they didn't even know that these rooms were there. And so the advice that I would get from mentors was always beautiful and important because in many ways they were my air traffic controllers, right? I was flying my plane, but they were the ones in my ear saying, go down 5,000 feet because there's turbulence ahead. Or we're going to redirect you because, you know, there's choppy air over here. So I really call them, they're my air traffic controllers. The ones in my ear give me direction as I'm trying to fly this plane. But I remember one piece of advice that I got from one of my air traffic controllers. And it's a gentleman named Bill Brody, who was the former president of Johns Hopkins. And I just come back from Afghanistan. I was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. And I finished my deployment and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And I had an offer to go work on Wall Street and go work in finance. And I thought he'd be really proud of that answer that, you know, I got this job on Wall Street. It's great. And when I said it to him, he kind of goes, huh. And I'm like, that's not the answer that I was expecting. And then he said to me, listen, I'm never going to question any decision that you ever make, especially one that you feel isn't the best interest of your family. Because he asked me, he said, why did you choose to do it? And I kind of gave 3 quick reasons. I was like, one is I know there's a lot of, you know, smart people there and I want to work with some really smart people. 2, it gave financial resources and I was helping to take care of my family and my mom, my grandparents. So this is going to be really helpful. 3, I thought it was really interesting work and it was stuff that I thought I could learn a lot from. And I really have, I like numbers. Numbers actually come much easier to me than the written word does. And so I was like, I think I could probably do pretty well there. And he said, you know, of all those things that you said, not once did you say because I'm passionate about it. And he said, again, I'm not going to judge you because what you do, especially if it's the right decision for your family, it's the right decision. But he said, but the thing I'm asking you is this, the moment you feel like you've gotten what you need to get out of there, leave. Because every day you stay doing something that you are not passionate about, you become extraordinarily ordinary. Mm. And that was indicting to me, this idea of being extraordinarily ordinary. Because the point that he was trying to make was when we talk about this idea of purpose, That's a very singular question for individuals to answer. I can give someone counsel on their purpose. I can give them advice. But at the end of the day, they're the only ones who can really answer that question for them. They're the only ones who can really say, this is what gives me purpose. This is what gives me a point. This is what, and one thing I like to say, this is what makes my heart beat a little bit faster. And I think that my quest, my journey has not just this idea of being able to understand what that is. It's also the ability to act on it. And it's the ability to move on it. And I think about the work that we do now. I know that the work that we do now, the work that I do now this is my life's point. How do we create essentially a coalition for fairness? How do we address issues of economic injustice and economic inequality that are actually giving people real opportunities for long-term and sustainable growth? How do we get to a point that we are not okay with acceptable levels of poverty? And how are we not going to be okay with making poverty more tolerable in people's lives, knowing the distinct and horrific impacts that it has on individuals and families and communities? It took a while, not just for me to be able to assess it, but it took a while for me then to be able to act on it and move on it, and then be okay with not looking at the other things. And so really the work for me was actually a very internal process as well as an external book. It was really kind of examining who were the people in my life that I had the pleasure of getting to know, getting to be around, getting to learn from, that showed me not just by their words, but also by their example of being able to find those things that make your heart beat a little bit faster, and then spending your life devoted to actually being able to address that. And so when I think about purpose, that's really what we're asking people to do, that there's no singular answer. For me, it's going to be something very different from somebody else, and that's perfectly fine. The point of purpose is that it's personal. And the point of making it personal is the fact that when you have those hard days, you'll come back for more tomorrow, because it's the thing that actually gives you life.
I enjoyed a segment in the book where you were talking to your grandparents, and I think your grandfather asked you that question, what do you do? Grandmother. And at one point, you said, you weren't going to make the bank. And she said, oh, that's so great. I'm going to have my neighbor over here give you her check so you can go deposit it for her. And I chuckled because I was raised by my grandmother, and I could just see that type of conversation, extremely proud. But at the same time, you are kind of thinking through internally, exactly, does this fulfill me?
Yes.
Late Congressman Elijah Cummings would say, does this fuel my soul?
Yes.
So, so I just want to thank you. And before we turn for Q&A from the audience, I'd love to hear a little bit about the book that you have coming out next month, 5 days.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit more about it.
So 5 days is really the story of 5 days in Baltimore through the eyes of 8 people. And it was really, it's the 5 days surrounding, and I know for Eugene and for many there are from, as we call it, the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. So it's a very personal story for a lot of us, but also something that really gained national and international attention. It was actually after a 25-year-old man named Freddie Gray made eye contact with police, eventually was arrested. After he was arrested, an hour after he was arrested, he was placed in a coma. And a week after he was placed in a coma, he died. And this led to weeks of protests in Baltimore City, which eventually led to, and peaceful protests in Baltimore City, but what eventually led to, on April 27th, when those protests were no longer peaceful, and eventually Maryland went into a state of emergency where the National Guard was actually called in. And really what I wanted to do was examine those 5 days through the eyes of 8 people, all from various and disparate aspects of life. One is a basketball star turned protester. One is the lawyer who actually represented the Gray family. Another one is a police major who actually grew up in West Baltimore and was one of the police officers who was in charge of that district. One was the son of the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, who was the head of baseball operations, that when the Baltimore Orioles played the Chicago White Sox, and for the first time in baseball history, they played an official game where the attendance was 0 because they played a game with no fans. And he was one of the key people who helped make that decision. But really understanding those 5 days through their lens, and understanding that, that not only was it an extraordinary period in American history, but that it wasn't just about Freddie. It wasn't just about policing in that moment, even though that had a very important role to play, and that was the spark that set everything off. But it was also about poverty and about economic injustice. It wasn't just about his death. It was about his life. It was about the reality that Freddie Gray was born 2 months premature, underweight, addicted to heroin, born to a mother who never made it to high school and battled addiction for much of her life. When him and his twin sister finally gained enough weight to leave the hospital, they moved into a housing project on North Carriage Street over in West Baltimore. That housing project, along with over 400 other homes, was later on named in a civil lawsuit because of the endemic levels of lead inside of that house. So here we have a person who was born underweight, premature, addicted to heroin, poisoned by lead, and at this time in his life, he's 2 years old. So the idea that, well, people who were living in poverty just need to work harder, how hard would Freddie had to have worked in order to overcome the obstacles that he saw in even just his young life, and his life that was also prematurely taken at 25 years old? How many hundreds of times could Freddie have died prior to when his life was actually taken at 25 years old? And what type of chance and opportunity did we give him? So I'm thankful that, we can have this conversation, even though the heartbreaking thing about this is this book has taken over, about 5 years to write, to put this entire book together. And the heartbreaking thing about it is the messages, the statements, the themes are just as relevant today as they were when this happened before. And that's what we have to address. How we can look through this time and this era and this scope through these lives, and being able to not just say what happened, but also be able to ask those really hard, but necessarily together questions of, but what do we do next? That's going to be the key questions we've got to answer.
Well, Wes, thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Ian Hartman, who's going to cue us in with some Q&A. I also want to acknowledge Ian and someone else who's not on the screen, Stacey Alexander, for all of their hard work on the AARP side to really pull this together for us today. What an amazing conversation. And again, Wes, thank you so much for just being an ultimate inspiration to all of us.
God bless you, Gene. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. So I'll go directly to the questions. And so there's this question around, why do you think some are able to overcome low expectations and broken systems and others are not? So how do we balance kind of the age-old debate between balancing systems reforms and self-reliance?
Yeah, it's such an important, beautiful question. I'll tell you a very quick story. I remember when the other Wes Moore first came out, I got a phone call from my publisher, and they said, listen, great news. Nick Kristof reached out and would like to write an op-ed about your book. And Nick Kristof, for those who don't know, is an op-ed writer for the New York Times, best-selling author, a progressive. And he wrote this beautiful piece where he says, I really enjoyed the other Wes Moore because I thought it was a great example and a great examination of race and class in our society. 3 weeks later, I get an email from the publisher saying, great news, Michael Gerson would like to write an op-ed about your book. For those who don't know, Michael Gerson is an op-ed writer for the Washington Times, Washington Post, a former speechwriter for President Bush. He's a conservative. And he writes this beautiful op-ed where he says, I really enjoyed the other Wes Moore because I thought it was a really powerful examination of personal responsibility and individual choice. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, this is fascinating. Because you had two people who both said they liked it and for two completely different reasons, for battling reasons in some respects. And so I remember my wife actually asked me once, she said, so who do you think was right? And my answer was, I think they both are, right? I think that there's this very complicated marriage that our society has of social and personal responsibility, where you cannot talk about society's fault without understanding. But at the end of the day, people are making individual choices, and individual choices must be understood and held to account. At the same time, you cannot talk about individual choices without understanding how those choices are being made in a societal context. So I think there is it's a brilliant and complicated marriage of these two elements that I think we have to internalize and understand, that part of our societal responsibility is put all of our children, all of our families, all of our communities, and create the right ecosystems for the best decisions to be made, for a list of options not to be minimized, for people to think that their decisions actually matter, and for people to understand that their decisions matter to more people than just them, and to care about that. So I think that becomes our societal push and our societal responsibility. Then I think we then have to put the proper amount of weight on the idea of individual choice. But when it comes to individual choice, we have to make sure that that individual choice is being had with choices and with options. And that's where I think those two things conflate. It's a great question.
So as a follow-up to that, we also have another question that I think is related. So we'll move on. That is this products of our expectations that you started with. And so this question relates to, if you could speak a little bit more on the systemic racism that is in play before these expectations even happened, even before birth. And going back to your new book, 5 Days, and the Freddie Gray story, if you could talk a little bit of how you see that plays into this expectations conversation.
Yeah, we can't look at the history of the United States and where we currently are without understanding the history of race in it, right? The history of race is littered, throughout all these conversations. If you look at where the lines are drawn when it comes to economic opportunity and lack of economic opportunity, those lines aren't there by accident, right? I mean, if you're talking about the city of Baltimore, it's just one example. This was the city that was the birth home to redlining. The idea of actually using physical infrastructure and transportation assets to divide communities, oftentimes exclusively based on race. Literally, historical document, historical fact. And so where people and communities are right now, you can't understand that without understanding the history of race within our society. We can't look at the impact of COVID-19 and why it's having such a disparate impact on communities of color without understanding why. And part of the reason why is that COVID-19 is it's an attacker of vulnerabilities. It attacks vulnerabilities. And so if you have communities, because of a lack of healthcare access, a lack of the healthcare disparities that we have with our society, oftentimes drawn by racial lines around things like everything from diabetes to heart disease to obesity, that COVID-19, one of the things that makes it so dangerous is it attacks those vulnerabilities. So when those discrepancies are there prior, you see how this is going to have a distinct impact on certain communities. And so I think part of the thing we have to be able to acknowledge is we have these conversations about race, not to play gotcha, but it is to say we can't be honest with ourselves as a society to think that we're just going to look at this from either a colorblind or a race neutral perspective, because our societal lines are not drawn that way. I remember saying once to somebody who was talking to me about American society, and they're saying, I wish we got to a point of being, post-racial. And I said, actually, I don't necessarily agree with the idea of saying that people should be post-racial. I want our society to be past a point of being post-racist, where so much of our structures have been created and established and sustained on race, where, you want people to be proud of histories and their cultures and everything like that, but you don't want people being discriminated because of it, or being sidelined because of it. And again, we bring this up not to play a game of gotcha or not to prove a point. We bring this up because if we're ever going to truly move forward as a society and have these things that we no longer have to deal with on a long-term basis, instead of continuing to deal with these fires that turn into conflagrations. It means being honest as a culture. It means being honest as a society. It means going through a real truth and reconciliation process in our own hearts and our own communities about why we are the way we are. And then saying, now, what are the things that we have to be able to do in unison to move forward, so we don't have to keep dealing with these same type of issues? These are important, they are present, they are relevant, and they have to be addressed honestly.
I think just to build on that and have a question to think about philanthropy and as your role as CEO of Robin Hood. So one question is, one of the most powerful equity transformations that has been seeded in philanthropy involves proximity and the need to drive more resources and support to proximate leaders, particularly in communities of color. What's the most powerful argument from your view about why this is so critical, and how can we make this case more powerfully to funders?
The most powerful argument that you can make to that case is, do you care if it works? Period. When the idea of why is proximity important, the answer is, and I think about, we think about this heavily as an organization. In fact, one of the things that we stress oftentimes is this idea that people who are closest to the challenge are going to be the ones who are closest to the solutions. If you care about getting to the solution, you have to make sure that proximity is your goalpost. You have to make sure that proximity is the thing that you lean on. It's the thing that you rely on. That there is not going to be a white paper or an op-ed that should shape how you think about your work more than the ideas, the suggestions, and the feedback of those who are the actually impacted community. We have at Robin, I think about our work right now, where we have an entity called the Design Insight Group. And the Design Insight Group is actually a very fancy way of saying it is about 1,400 people who are currently living and existing in poverty right now in New York City. They are people who are paid by Robin Hood. They're part of our team. They're part of our family. And they essentially serve as much of not just the UX and the UI, the people who are, thinking about the technologies and think about the things that we invest in the organizations, but now they're actually part of the group that's helping to make our grant making decisions. So when we're talking about who makes, when you pull back the curtain of Robin Hood or many of these philanthropic organizations, but I think about Robin Hood in particular, it's like, who's making the decisions about who gets grants? Is it our members of our program team? Absolutely. And people who have devoted their life to being able to make the best data-driven analytical decisions. Is it people who are members of our board and leadership council committee and people who are devoting their time and their resources to this issue? Absolutely. Are they nationwide experts? Absolutely. But you know who it also is? It's impacted communities. They're also helping to determine who's getting the grants. They're helping to determine which organizations we should be looking at and supporting. And that is an incredibly important part of a secret sauce, not just now, but how we're going to think about this work for years and years and years to come. And so thinking about that of proximity, it's not because it sounds good. It's not because it's a cool thing to do or it's in vogue. It's because we care about if it works. And if you care about your philanthropy working, you had better make sure that impacted communities are actually part of your decision-making processes.
So I think, Gene, unfortunately, we've reached time. I don't know if you have any final remarks or final thoughts, and thank you again, Wes, for taking these questions and for spending this full hour with us.
Just want to say thanks again, Wes. Really appreciate your leadership. I think, Ian, you're going to close us out. Again, thank you, Wes, so much. We will definitely be following up with you, and hopefully we can do this again in person.
Well, I'll say just, and I'll close and just say, this is absolutely my honor. I'm not just hugely grateful for the work of AARP and the work of all of you individual, but I'm just incredibly grateful to be soldiers with all of you and citizens in this fight. We're dealing with something right now that is going to have a very long tail. And for many of the families and the communities that you all are protecting and working with, and many of your families just like mine, these are communities that should and will have not just direct implications of the decisions that are making right now, but will help to determine how we responded in this era, how we responded to this challenge. We will be better off because of it. but it's not because of inevitability. We'll be better because we make it so. We'll be better because we push for it to be better. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to do that with all of you for years and years to come. So bless you and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you to Gene. And once again, I'd like to thank Wes Moore for joining us today to share his unique insights on how we can begin to rebuild our communities to serve everyone equally. We're really excited to read his new book, 5 Days, coming out in a couple of weeks. And we really greatly appreciate all of you joining us today. This is the first in a series of conversations brought to you by AARP and the Social Innovation Summit on how we build equity into our recovery. Our next conversation is going to take place on Wednesday, June 17th, where we explore longevity in more detail, where we've made progress, where we continue to struggle, and the implications of the coronavirus pandemic. Next week, we'll send around to everyone here on this line some early registration details for June 17th and all of our upcoming events in this series. So stay tuned for that email. Again, on behalf of AARP and our entire team, thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.